I'd like to invite our debaters to come forward. If you could join us on the platform here. I think Elizabeth, you'll be going first. Is that?
Do you want me to start here?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm just going to introduce our the context of our debate. We've been hearing about different types and different forms of evaluation, different types of evidence, and our question, if we could have, I think we've got the motion up there. This House believes that a robust user review is sufficient to evaluate most digital health apps. So, without detail counting, I would like those in favour to raise your hands. Those who support the motion. Okay. Great. Okay. That's right. Those who oppose the motion, raise your hands. Okay. So we've actually got quite a strong view on that, and what we're going to hear from is really different perspectives on this particular question, and particularly interesting to see whether we get some regression to the mean, whether we alter your perspectives on this, and we'll have a debate among ourselves. We'll widen this up. We're going to have strict rules. 5 minutes. I'm going to make a sound, so bells and stop you. And we're going to move through Elizabeth to Eve, and then Charles, and then moving through André, and then David. I think that's our batting order. Okay, so Elizabeth, I'm delighted as our first presenter, who's Professor of e-health and primary care from UCL. Take it away.
Thanks. I have a tagline, which is that mental health apps are not washing machines. Now, yeah, I'm hoping that it's come up. Now, before you think, now what is that woman on? I'm going to explain to you why I think mental health apps are not washing machines. And I think that crowd rating or crowdsourcing or whatever you want to call it is entirely appropriate for washing machines because they've got a very clear function. They're supposed to clean our clothes. We put dirty clothes in and we take, hopefully, clean clothes out. And it's a very causal and immediate relationship. And I would submit that almost all of us feel competent to judge whether our clothes are adequately clean or not when we take them out. And there may be some other criteria we use to choose what washing machine we want to use. We may be worried about cost. We may be worried about energy efficiency. And if we are worried about energy efficiency, there's some really clear EU energy ratings, and we may not understand the detail of them. I certainly couldn't tell you how you get to be an A+ or a G, but I know that they exist, and I can understand them, and I can apply them. And then I might have some more personal things. I might want a particular colour. Perhaps I'd like a pink washing machine with red spots on it. Or perhaps I want one that's very, very quiet because I don't want to be waking everybody up. Or perhaps I want a quick wash. And these are all things that not only am I very able to judge, and I feel very confident in my ability to judge these criteria, but because I feel very confident in my ability to judge them, I also trust other people's ability to judge it. So for that reason, crowdsourcing, crowd rating, is entirely appropriate for washing machines. But my argument is that mental health apps are not washing machines. And the very first thing I would say is that it's very difficult to know whether a mental health app works or not. And if it wasn't difficult, there wouldn't be a whole industry of academic and research that goes into running these quite complex, expensive trials, and we do pilot work to get an initial size, and we try and work it all out. And we heard excellently from Karolinska about how you go through piloting, and then you go through trials, and then you try and see if you can replicate the same effect in the normal clinical environment, and then you go into implementation. Fantastic, but difficult. And quite difficult as a clinician, as an academic, as a policymaker, as a commissioner, to know whether something's working or not. And we all know about research that said such and such is wonderful and it works, and then 3 years later there's research that says, oops, sorry, it doesn't work. Shouldn't have prescribed it to all those patients. Oops. So I think there's a central uncertainty about knowing whether a mental health app works, let alone whether it works for me. So that means that as a user, we have to rely entirely on those judgment criteria that are a bit like colour and noisiness. That is it usable? And do we like the tone that the app takes? Does it talk to us like the sort of person we want to be talked about? And we have to take on trust that it works. And I don't think that's satisfactory, because you can ask yourself, well, does that matter? And I think it does matter, because there are two situations. The first situation is where the NHS is paying. And if the NHS is paying, we all know we've got a limited budget. Clearly, anything that the NHS is paying for has to go through the same rigorous procedures as everything else it pays for, because otherwise there's less money for stuff that really does work. And then there's the second situation, which is where users are paying. And then you could say, oh, well, it's only the users. Perhaps they can spend their money if they want to. Who cares? Well, I would really argue against that, because I would say that there are three opportunity costs, really. The first is that if a user is engaging in something that doesn't work, they're diverting energy and time from something that might work. The second is that when people don't get better with a treatment, they often refer to themselves as having failed. I have failed treatment. I have failed. Not this treatment didn't work. Now that's really bad for us as users. And then the third thing is that because you've tried something that doesn't work, you think everything like it's not going to work. And so it makes you really reluctant to engage in other treatments that might work. And although I could go on, I'm going to stop. Yes. Whew, just got in there.
Thank you for Elizabeth and for the new washing machines. We're going to move on now to Eve Critchley from Mind, and Eve is Digital Community Manager for Mind. Is going to give, I think, a slightly different perspective on this motion. Eve.
So, tough crowd then. Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with Elizabeth that it is really difficult. If you struggled with your mental health, or you know someone who has, you'll probably also know that it wasn't one thing that made the difference. So you might have tried medication, CBT, other types of therapy, mindfulness, self-care, change of exercise, like any number of things. And there might have been times where it felt like it was working, and then there might have been times, and there probably were times, where you actually felt worse as well and felt quite discouraged by what was happening. And while at Mind we'll keep stressing that mental health should have equal status to physical health, it is different as well. We know that life, society, people around you, biology, like all of these things have an impact. And when you add discrimination, previous bad experiences of care and services into the mix, finding the right help gets even tougher. But in this, what looks like a fairly bleak picture, there is a definite cause for hope, and that's things like peer support and services or tools that are genuinely shaped by user experiences. What traditional mental health services don't always acknowledge is the transformative effect that choice and control over your care, or even better, designing your own care, can have. So just knowing that you have some choices can leave you feeling sort of better and safer. Even if a service isn't perfect, seeing user reviews or getting recommendation from a friend can really encourage you to give it a go, and perhaps just focus on the aspects that do work for you. Obviously, there are plenty of apps that aren't accessible, usable, or helpful, but I would say the same of many mental health services. If you look at, I was encouraged to see Alexia mention sort of NICE guidelines, and not just looking at those. Plenty of GPs feel confident about prescribing SSRIs. But what if, you fail at SSRIs, which are prescribed and people feel confident about? And what many in the tech world are good at doing is focusing on the user need and responding to it really quickly, and using design tools to engage end users in the production of apps. Safety, security, sustainability, they're obviously all big issues, but they're also ones that we in the charity sector and in the NHS can help with, through expertise or resource as well. And there's a much bigger question here, which we've touched on, about standards of evidence. So those of us who've been involved with peer support will be quite familiar with this sort of question. You know, we get told that the evidence for it is quite thin, too thin to commission sometimes. But it's something a lot of us will turn to when traditional services fail us, and we know it works for us. So maybe rather than expecting tech providers and designers or individuals with a big idea to match clinical standards of evidence, are there things that academics and clinicians can be learning about more agile, more engaging forms of research? Because knowing what we do know about traditional mental health treatments and services, is that really where we want to set the bar?
Thank you, Eve. So our next debater is Charles Lowe from the Digital Health and Care Alliance. And Charles will say you're quite your experience in this field goes back to really to the beginning, I think, of
well, digital health,
digital health,
not apps,
digital
yes,
health more
yes,
generally.
yes,
Charles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and just to pick up on that one to start with, I was involved with something called the Health System Demonstrator in Newham that was seeking to demonstrate the benefits of telecare and telehealth. And as any of you who were around some time ago will be aware, that randomized control trial took 8 years finally to deliver its result, and it was a pretty tepid result. And what I learned from that was that if you are going to do a randomized control trial of a digital health intervention, you need to change the process, you need to educate the people, you need to do things differently. Because unlike drugs, any form of digital health will probably benefit you about 5% of the total benefit just by installing the equipment, and 95% of the benefit will come from doing things in a different way. And that has very much imbued my approach to digital health ever since. Now, when I was appointed to be the managing director of DACA, Digital Health and Care Alliance, a couple of years ago, my first task was to go around asking doctors why they weren't recommending medical apps to their patients. And interestingly, we got 2 results. One was there was fear, uncertainty and doubt. They didn't understand them. They didn't understand the regulation. And we've cracked that in DACA now by producing a 44-page summary of all of the regulation that applies to medical apps and also to wearables and a number of other things too. And the other thing was that there was no assessment of the benefits. They didn't know why they should recommend a particular app. NICE hadn't recommended it, and they were unsure as to whether it was actually beneficial, which led me to go to NICE, initially Professor Mike Kelly, who's now retired, and then Alexia, and to lobby them hard to do something about this. At exactly the same time, Workstream 1.2 set up, so I'm involved in a stakeholder board for 1.2, and also the accelerated access review too. We also, as DACA, did a major response to the European Commission on their green paper on medical apps, the end result of which is we're also very involved now in their code of conduct, drafting their code of conduct on information privacy. I was going to quote the Abrams review that Alexia has already mentioned as essentially my support for the fact that whilst user review is very good, it's not in itself sufficient. Because, of course, as Alexia pointed out, the downloads were inversely correlated to the evidence and the effectiveness. Now, I row, occasionally I row quite seriously, and people come along and they say, well, we've got this way of you getting really fit and you don't have to work very hard. And I can assure you it doesn't work. You have to work hard. And exactly the same is true with an app. It has to be an app that really does the job properly, and it might not be very appealing if you want to convince yourself that you're actually giving up something, but you don't want to work hard at it. History suggests also that when people are looking at apps, they don't pay attention to every aspect. Julie Bretland, for example, quotes a torch app that I think requires 16 different permissions, including access to your friends and God knows what, in order to make your mobile phone give you a beam to see your way, which is clear evidence of the fact that you don't get out for nout, as we used to say when I was young. Indeed, the whole system demonstrator, to my way of thinking, suggests that even academics don't understand the need to see the evidence in the round. So just sort of winding up now, I see a situation here where on a number of occasions you can get an app and a drug which will do the same thing. Similar interventions. So you can, for example, as I understand it, I'm no psychiatrist, but I understand you can treat depression and anxiety, and one of the activities that ADI, that I work very closely with, has been doing recently is something called Pain Sense, which is an app that will actually treat pain too, rather than drugs. And so I believe that they should both be evaluated in the same way, and there's certainly no way in which drugs have ever, in recent history anyway, been passed by NICE on the basis of user feedback. So I just believe, to finish therefore, that you need to evaluate apps in their own pathway, but you do need to give them a full evaluation, as Alexia has described very effectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. And our next debater is André Tomlin from the Mental Health. André.
I've written a speech. I have a tendency to say very unevidence-based, off-the-cuff things at these sorts of events. So I wanted to make sure I didn't do that. So I'm the person behind the Mental Health and the National ELF Service. I'm the person responsible for the terrible puns and fabulous blogs on that website. I'm opposed to this motion. I think we need evidence-based research to evaluate mental health apps, especially those apps that are concerned with the treatment of mental illness. I also think that robust user review is essential so that we can produce accessible and usable apps. But I think that randomized studies are the way to test the efficacy of an intervention. I wanted to say a few words just to put this into context and then tell you a little bit about my own experience. It's well documented that the NHS mental health services are at breaking point right now. Referrals to community and crisis services are on the increase. Waiting list targets are being missed. And the reality for people is really stark. 1 in 6 people on waiting lists for mental health services are expected to attempt suicide. 4 in 10 are expected to self-harm. 6 in 10 will likely see their condition deteriorate before having the opportunity to see a mental health professional. And obviously apps aren't a solution to that. But many of us in this room have experience of how they can help support and provide services to people. So it seems to me quite logical that we look at apps as one way to help in the current climate. But obviously they have to be safe and effective if they're going to do this. So looking at the debate question, I was struck by how the phrase robust user review could mean many things. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why only 2 or 3 people put their hand up when they were asked to support the motion. You know, on the one hand, it could be the kind of crowdsourcing of user reviews that you see in many app stores. On the other hand, it could be a much more structured review carried out by a trained professional, maybe leading some kind of co-production project. The process chosen by the former NHS Apps Library was neither of those things, but it did purport to offer a quality-controlled gateway to reliable apps. We published a blog recently by Simon Lee, who asked some questions earlier on, health economist in the audience, who showed that the 27 mental health apps that were accredited for use by patients in the NHS Apps Library Only 14 of them, 14 of them were designated for treatment or management of depression and anxiety, but only 4 of those 14 apps were able to provide any tangible evidence of outcomes as reported by real-world users to substantiate their claims. And just 2 of those 14 apps made use of NHS-validated performance measures. So the bottom line with that now defunct NHS apps library is that we remain completely in the dark about the safety and effectiveness of 85% of the apps that were accredited by the NHS. So it's vital that whatever evaluation process replaces this system is fit for purpose. This is not just a problem in England, obviously it's an international problem. There was a review recently by Martinez Perez that found just 32 articles about depression apps that were published, research articles, in 10 years from 2003 to 2013, which is in stark contrast to the number of depression apps that were developed in that period, about 1,500. So what essentials do we need today if we're assessing the quality of mental health apps? I would suggest 4 things. Firstly, apps that are co-designed and co-produced by patients, developers, practitioners, researchers. Secondly, apps that are supported by mental health practitioners. We know from systematic reviews that apps that are supported by mental health practitioners are more than twice as effective as those that aren't. Apps that are approved by regulatory bodies in the absence of our own system in the UK. And finally, apps with evidence of clinical effectiveness and safety. And it's that last requirement that I think is the most controversial. We've spent a lot of time considering that in this group over the last couple of years. And we're also thinking about how to evaluate our own product, our National Health Service website, which is aimed at health professionals. And one approach that we're considering is the stepped wedge randomized controlled trial, which has a number of advantages in this area. One key aspect in the methodology is that it allows developers to carry on working on the technology whilst the trial is ongoing. So the intervention can evolve as the study takes place, which means you don't fall into the trap that you sometimes have with recent RCTs. The REACT trial, as we mentioned a couple of times already today, it took a few years to produce that randomized controlled trial, and by the time it was published, the technology was obsolete. And I think actually one of the companies that produced the online CBT has now gone bust. We had a fringe debate last night about this, and about clinical research and apps. And there was really broad agreement in our group about the chasm between evidence-based research and fast-paced technology development. And we have to work together to close that gap. That's the major challenge that I think we face. And as Chris said in his opening speech, better, faster, smarter, real-world evidence base. I think that's the challenge for the NHS, to produce a transparent methodology that measures the accessibility and usability and reliability of apps.
Thank you, André. And our final debater, David Cox from Headspace. Yeah.
Thanks, Tris. Just for anybody who has no idea what Headspace is, we are a company that makes digital tools to teach you how to meditate. And I'm an ex-NHS doctor, so you can imagine the first thing I had to do was get over my significant cynicism with respect to meditation. But now I find myself responsible for overseeing all of the science and research work that we do, trying to show where the benefits might be from regularly meditating. So it's really interesting to hear what everybody's said so far. Actually, I'm going to prevaricate a lot and agree and disagree with that statement. And why is that? Well, I think because actually the problem with the statement is that it doesn't consider the broad range of potential apps. And I like to oversimplify things robustly, so I'm going to oversimplify and say, broadly, there are supportive apps in mental health, and there are apps that aim to treat. And I think if you look at those two groups separately, this statement is different. So as written, I think I agree, because it says most digital mental health apps. If you go into the App Store and look at digital mental health apps, by number, by volume, most of them are there to support. And so as such, absolutely, you know, people will be vocal about whether or not they are helpful. And actually, when you're supporting somebody, whether you feel supported, that's a prom and a prem, is probably what's most important. However, if you're looking at treatment, then I think you're in an entirely different realm. And so when I came to Headspace with a doctor's mindset, I set out to do the impossible and said, okay, if we're going to convince the skeptics like me that this thing can treat, we have to set the bar as high as it has to be. And in fact, the height of the bar is probably proportional to the amount of skepticism. So I've spent the last year working on creating the tools to allow us to do a fully double-blind active RCT using an app that teaches you how to meditate to find out whether or not it can help in treatment. And we are now starting the pilot studies in clinical trials in collaboration with the NHS to do exactly that using these tools. So I think when you're at the treatment end of the wedge, no, absolutely, I think you need a much higher bar. There's been a couple of things said so far that I think it bears paying attention to. For me, the burden of proof when you're talking about treatment lies with the developer. They have to do whatever it is that they deem necessarily, and you could say, subject to resource constraints, actually, the more they do, the better, to put forward the case to say this thing treats. The burden that the NHS holds is one of evaluating whether or not that proof is sound, sufficient, rigorous, etc., etc. So I think for me that's the kind of key distinction. I understand that there are potentially barriers therefore to innovation because actually that burden of proof, as I've just described, is quite high. It's taken me a year just to build the tools to be able to do this kind of research. But then equally I'm starting with something which in the medical community, great, many people actually do feel implicitly that meditation could probably help. But there's a huge number of people that go, what? Seriously? So I have to prove to a very, very high level of rigor, and therefore I've had to set the highest bar that is the same as the kind of pharmaceutical industry. So I don't know if that's shed very much light. Either way, I agree and I disagree.
Okay, we're just trying to get a chair for Alexia. Is that? Oh, we got one there. Great, thanks very much. So we will actually have a revote, but I won't do it right now. This is our time for you to get involved in this debate, and I would like you can either make a statement for or against, or just a statement, or you can ask a question and direct it to one of the debaters, just to say which one. So please, our mics, and just look for the hands up. There's one here. Yep.
Hi, my name's Steve Flatt. I'm a co-author with Simon Lee of Apps, Friend or Foe. I think this debate has interested me enormously, but I'd like you actually to take a step back for a second, because one of the things that fascinates me is in mental health is the tool that we have is language. That's what we use. And it's interesting that in here, we talk about solutions, we talk about ways forward, we talk about all other kinds of things. When we talk to our clients, if we use CBT, dialectic behavior therapy, all these other things, and I'm a therapist, we tend to talk about problems. The language between the way we talk as professionals and the way we tend to talk with our clients is quite different. And we need to begin to think about what it is that we're actually doing at that level. Then we might be able to understand what our apps are actually doing as well. It was Richard Feynman who made the statement very clearly, famous scientist, probably one of the most incredible scientists ever existed. He talked about witch doctors, and he said, the witch doctor puts on a snakeskin, and he does a dance, and he provides the person he's doing the dance for with the bark from a tree. Until we begin to explore what it is that is actually effective, the nature of the language that we use, we don't know whether it's the quinine or the snakeskin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Lesserite consultant psychiatrist. My question is more about, is it possible to empower users to make these decisions? The approach of us evaluating everything and saying, yes, it's okay for the user, in many ways is quite paternalistic. So is it possible to empower users to make the right decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I think because we've had quite a lot about measures and outcome measures and what's the right outcome measure, but if you actually work with people to identify what does good look like for you, then I think you're in a much better position to be able to evidence whether something's working or not. Like filling out a measures form, for example, might actually be a negative experience in itself if you've found that really unhelpful before. So one thing that we've done with Ellie Friends, which is our online community, is work with members of the community to define those outcomes themselves and to use kind of naturalistic data to help evidence those as well, so people don't have to stop and fill out a form. So yeah, I think really great question. I'd like to see more of that as well, rather than how can we kind of measure these things that already exist against a completely different set of criteria.
I think we've got to take this side. And people who haven't answered a question already, so got a couple of hands up.
Yeah, shall I? Sorry, I've got the mic, so
Yeah,
I'm just
Mike,
going to
you've
take
got
the
the mic.
opportunity.
Say who you are.
I'm really glad I come after your question, because where I'm coming from, it's a sort of strange...
Sorry, could you just say who you are,
Helen
where you're
Lees, Newman University. It's a strange double place, but it links very closely to this, in that I research silence and its uses, but I'm a developer of an app which is silence-based, and I would suggest that it could be a medical device. But I'm also a researcher of democratic interaction and democratic education. So those two things come together to suggest that when we are developing apps and when we're trying to get them into the health arena, we can ask, well, where is the evidence base? Does it need to be afterwards? Or can we have a research base that is linked to all the research on silence and its uses, but also that involves itself in how that app behaves, but also how the user uses that app? Because, as an example, silence doesn't work as a medical device, in inverted commas, unless the user chooses to interact with it. And what I think we should pay more attention to is the democratic voice of the user. And that is very much missing when we have a sort of an institutional approach to doing things to people for their well-being. So choice there is part of the medical health care approach, but it's also about respecting people when they interact with medical health care. So I agree.
Anybody like to respond? Yeah, David and then Charles.
Yeah,
yep.
sure.
Yep.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. One of the things, I'm going to agree with you, one of the things that I've heard a couple of times today that causes me concern is, has this app been developed on a base of evidence? Which is great where there is one. But if you're coming at something really innovating, then kind of by definition there probably isn't one, and there needs at least to be recognition that there needs to be a mechanism by which you are able to develop that evidence base. And I think what you're saying comes into that, because that evidence base can be broad and needs to take into account the people's experience and their choices, as well as the sort of more traditional scientific ideology of what the evidence is or should be.
Yeah, I was just going to give a slightly different slant and an answer to that. Professor Jeremy Wyatt, who is very an academic, I think he's now working down in, is it Southampton? He used to be in Leeds. And he has an alternative idea about how apps might be appraised. And that is what he calls the engineering approach. So, for example, he says if you're going to build a bridge, you build it on sound engineering principles. You don't do a randomized control trial of bridges. And he takes things like cognitive behavioral therapy, to quote one example. I guess silence could well be another. And he uses the evidence on that and says if an app is built using these blocks, then there are only a few things that you actually need to be testing and checking, because you've already checked each one of those individual blocks. I do appreciate there will be times when the interaction between them may cause problems, but I think it's an interesting and a very different view, and one that hopefully at some stage in the future we'll be able to move towards, because I can assure you, having done a randomized control trial of telecare and telehealth, and even then not doing it within its own change pathway, took such a long time. And it was so difficult to do that the thought of doing that for any more than a very few of the many medical health apps that there are out there is just scary. It really is.
Hello, my name's Danielle Singer-Moore. I'm a designer, software developer, and service user. This whole event is inspired by the advance of technology, but also importantly, how it places power into the hands of the user. We've developed an incredibly innovative and intuitive system and service. Is the NHS ready for that?
Somebody wants to respond to André? Or?
Does it save time and money? They're ready.
Yeah. The front, yeah.
Hi, Chris O'Sullivan here from Mental Health Foundation. Very useful debate, very timious with some work that we're doing in Glasgow at the moment with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. I was going to make a point about the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed, but I think that's been made in terms of the range of innovations which happen that have some evidence base to support it. So the first point I would make is, can we have or develop for the digital field a way of expressing the theoretical underpinnings of some promising approaches so that innovators can use those? Secondly, I think André and I were tweeting about this just during the debate, actually. The difference between, well, the definitions of robust and user. I think there's something massively significant in the potential for lived experience-led user research, looking at some of the principles around audience development and user and UX development in digital innovation, and actually applying that with some of the robust academic principles around lived experience research. And I think I would be very interested to hear the panel's thoughts on that, because we need, I think, to bring together in the crucible the innovation sector, the policy sector, the practice sector, and the research sector, because everyone's going off on different tracks at the moment, and there's a danger that we become app blind, that we build apps because we must have apps because other people have apps and there needs to be an app in our CCG or our board area. The final thing I will say, well, two things actually. I'm going to, whilst I've got the mic. One is about funding for evaluation. Having worked in the third sector and in some of the innovation startup sector in relation to app development, lots of people would love to be able to evidence their app, but no funders who fund them fund evaluation, and it's the first thing that they take out. So could I put a plea in place for academic funders and commissioners and charitable funders to fund robust evaluation, which is user-led, as part of digital innovation programs? And my final question for the panel, I do promise. Repurposing of apps. We've talked a lot today about the development of new apps to and addressing particular problems, but we know that people with mental health problems out there are repurposing existing tools like Facebook, like Twitter, like other things, and making spaces with the tools that do exist. What are we doing about understanding those dynamics and making sure that they are understood and accepted by health professionals as equally valid?
Okay, thank you for that contribution. André, would you like to respond?
Yeah, a couple of things I'd like to come back to there. Your point about user research, I think this is a real opportunity to raise our aspirations for mental health services. So rather than using existing measures, let's integrate kind of new forms of research as well, because like Elizabeth was saying, it's not like buying a washing machine, but it's also not like anyone else really knows what the right advice is as well. And often it's only by trying a range of things that you do find out what is the right thing. So I don't think we can say that this is the process and this is how we can say we're confident that this is the right intervention there. Also picking up on the point about funding for evaluation as well, I think that's really important. We found some good support from local universities with that, and are investing at the moment in a large program of evaluation around peer support, which is a kind of multi-strand program as well. So looking at the economic impact, the sort of outcomes stuff as well. And there's a good strand of peer-led sort of user research in there as well. So I think it's taking that kind of multi-strand approach we're finding to be very effective.
Just wondered if I can ask Elizabeth also just to comment on the RCT. It's come under quite a lot of challenge, I think, but also we've heard some innovative ideas. I don't want to say there's still life in the RCT.
Thanks, Chris. I'll see you later. there are two issues, aren't there? One is that it's not trials or TripAdvisor. And I think that's the point that people have been trying to make, is that we need it all. And just like when we develop health apps, we need to be bringing together, first and foremost, users and clinicians and researchers and software developers and people who do web design and HCF, people who do human-computer interaction. Equally, when we do evaluations, we need to be looking at the full range of evaluative methods. And of course, we need to be borrowing from engineering and computer science. Many of you here will be completely familiar with the MRC complex interventions cycle. Engineering and computer science has a similar cycle, but it doesn't have the same words in the boxes. It's much more about problem, try something, get some feedback, revise it. Is it addressing the problem? And you're going round. And I think one of the problems is that in health services research, and with respect, Charles, the whole systems demonstrator is a perfect example of what I'm about to say, is that people go to trials much too quickly. They go to trials before they've worked out whether it's the bark or the snakeskin. They go to trials before they find out whether people can use it, would want to use it, and having once got access to it, do they engage with it in a way that enables them to get the benefit? Again, we heard about non-use in the whole systems demonstrator. It's a huge problem. There's a whole issue around working with health professionals. So how are we going to get these things integrated? I absolutely agree that we need to be that users need to be empowered, and that users should and can have the options to choose what it is that they're wanting. But for some users, we'll want to do that in a reasonably supported way, so that they're choosing between options that seem likely to be useful. So that you're not just putting your hand blind into a bag and taking something out with nobody's saying to you this might help. So I think it is about that supported use. For some users, the support will be entirely from other service users. From some, they will also want some health professional input. And so it's about horses for courses. It's about methods for questions. But we shouldn't throw the trial out. In the end, once you've got something that people use and like, and it addresses a clear problem, it's perfectly integratable into the service and people can see how to do it, and it is it's working in a service. You still need to know whether it is effective and cost effective.
I just wanted to ask a question of the audience, because this point keeps coming up: co-design, co-production, brilliant idea, we should all be doing it, isn't it great? And I think the point that Mark Brown made just after our debate last night was that we need to create new spaces in which to do that, because those groups of people haven't really worked together before, and there's often quite significant culture clashes that go on. And it plays to your point about language, I think, because that often, the jargon monitor is busy in those meetings. So I wondered whether people had examples of that, of bringing together, evidence-based researchers and developers. And okay.
Great, thanks.
That's our USP.
Yeah, this one at the back.
I'm Jeff Cox. I'm a counsellor in private practice, and I'm a little bit concerned about apps in that they seem to be there to solve a problem or an issue. And I find in my work, what people come with is not often it's not the underlying issue. And in any app, I would hope it would seek to do that, and for the individual to gain an understanding of why they are where they're at. And it's not just a problem they have. As we saw in an earlier slide, and I'm sorry I can't remember the person who presented it, but the development of mental health starts at a very early age and can do with misuse, abuse, etc. And I would just hope that there was some app designed to help gain greater self-awareness and understanding of ourselves, and not just try to solve a problem.
Great, thanks. Problem of measurement. I think there's one. We'll have a couple more. Yeah.
My name is Charles Nduka. I'm a plastic surgeon specialising in facial surgery. Very much an outsider here, and I have a question because I've been developing an app around tracking facial expressions, and obviously facial expressions are important in mental health, and have been debating this question about trials or not. We had some funding to do an initial pilot study, and recently didn't get funding for the subsequent trial. If we were to change the debate around this and take away the word apps and substitute it for, say, supplements or vitamins, something that some people find very beneficial for their, I've got a cold, I want to take some vitamin C. It does no harm. It does some good in terms of not bothering the GP. It does the economy some good because there's more sales. How can we study things when they're out in the open there for patients to access in terms of doing a trial once we've done the full evaluation, if they are working for some patients but not everyone?
Charles,
Can I respond to that? There was a comment made by Tim Kelsey a while back, quoting someone else, that said that we don't do trials of books, so why should we do trials of apps? And of course, the answer to that is that books typically don't calculate, and that documents, as you were mentioning, if I heard you right, will tell you what it's all about, but they won't do stuff that's hidden away. And it's the fact that there's stuff hidden away in the app, that it can be sending information in an unencrypted form that you're unaware of. It could be sending it to people you don't want it to be sent to. There could be an error in the equation in there that means that you have to take much more care over apps than you do over many other forms of intervention.
I think we're just going to have to wrap up, so if you haven't spoken before and can speak to the motion, I think there's somebody in the middle, because I know it's hard for you to get the mic. Okay, and then we'll wind up. Oh, it's on? Yeah.
I want to support the call for collaborative research with people with lived experience, but also clinicians. It's something we've been doing with a serious game with forensic mental health service users, just to give that a plug. But more importantly, I think whoever is doing the research, the big problem is the speed of research funding and getting research processes up and running. And you're often talking about 18 months, 2 years, even longer, when you include ethics and everything. And I just wonder whether the panel would support the idea of some sort of real sort of gambling of giving groups of people working on something a pot of money and just say, go on and get on with it, rather than having a really drawn-out application process.
Great. I'm not sure we've got any funders. Do we have any funders on the panel? I'd like to respond to that.
As long as you don't have to do a Dragon's Den style pitch, yeah. I'd be supportive of that idea, yeah.
I'd also like to just come back on that one, and that while innovation is sort of really important, I think kind of starting with the innovation may not be the sort of best approach. We could easily plough lots of technology into identifying kind of signs of depression or things like that, but we kind of, if you actually ask people what are the kind of most pressing issues for them, I think that's a better place to start. And I think, even this sort of whole process, I'm not sure, has it come from people's concerns about apps, or has it come from clinicians' concerns about apps? I think just kind of maybe our starting point will inform kind of where the resource should go.
Okay, well, I think unfortunately we're beaten by the clock. It's been a fantastic debate. I'd like to thank all our debaters, please, for Can I just, before we just have a show of hands again to see, so in favour of the motion, has anyone been furtherly swayed? Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty. And those against? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you again. Okay. So we're going to move on before lunch to something that probably seems very different, but I actually think is very much connected to what we've been discussing. It's on the was on the left-hand side, thinking about monitoring, about how we use data in really exciting new ways in mental health care. So I'm delighted to welcome Matthew Hotopf from the BRC for Mental Health, who's going to be talking about remote monitoring.
Thanks. Those of you who are more observant may notice the title of my talk has changed, and I apologise. I was going to talk about a new grant, but we've slightly jumped the gun. So I'm going to talk more broadly about enriching about enriching clinical data, partly for research purposes, partly for improving patient outcomes, partly from the purpose of health planning. So I run the Biomedical Research Centre at the Maudsley, which is all about bringing innovation to the clinic. And one of the areas we've been really working on has been around digital health. And in a sense, one of the challenges, actually, what's happened to my... here we are, sorry. Slide slightly out of order. One of the challenges we have is the nature of healthcare providers and what data comes out of health records. So if you imagine this is time, and this is an individual patient service user with depression or any mental disorder, but who is making occasional contacts with the GP, then something happens, they have an episode of specialist care, they go back to the GP, they might get discharged here and then have more difficulties further down the line. You have this data which is highly complex. There's lots of unstructured data, with one or two rare exceptions, IAPTIS being one of them. We're absolutely hopeless at taking, using clinical outcomes in a routine way, patient-reported outcomes, patient-valued outcomes in a routine way. And we often have very incomplete measurement of outcomes. It's data which is unstructured, so it tends to be text. And we don't have very much information on things like risk factors. And of course, the time points where the person is actually making contact are entirely linked to their clinical state. Okay, so that's clinical practice and the challenge we have there. And of course, we also got the problem of data resting in the primary care and data resting in secondary care, which is complex. Then in terms of research, if you imagine someone who's going into one of these randomized controlled trials, say, or being followed up in an observational study, the researcher is regulating the time points when the person is being seen, so that's a bit better. You have a detailed baseline assessment, but you have this frustration that the outcomes are little snapshots of something going on. It no way reflects the richness of the lived experience of the individual, and it basically isn't making use of what one might do with data, particularly in the digital era. And this is reflected in a slide which I've borrowed from a colleague, Ken Kabuto of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, who's doing research on Parkinson's disease. And what they've done is developed a patient cohort of newly diagnosed people with Parkinson's disease, and they're doing deep and frequent phenotyping, which means they're doing all sorts of tests on them, be it blood-based tests looking at every omics you can imagine, be it neuroimaging, PET scanning, fMRI, be it electrophysiology and EEG. So they're doing this very detailed, intensive look at these individuals and following them over time. And he represented, he's in charge of the data here, and he represented the petabyte level of data as the Empire State Building, okay? That's all the data. And the clinical data, the things the individuals fill out as questionnaires or clinical interviews, was represented by 0.1 of a micron. So you have this enormous mismatch between the kind of big data challenge which has come out of biological sciences, where we have these enormous high-density data sets, and the clinical data, which is actually minuscule. Yet the clinical data is actually the lived experience of the individual. It's the information which clinicians actually make clinical judgments on, and it's what matters to people. It's how are you feeling this day to the next. So what I'm really trying to deal with is how does one actually get a handle on this a bit better? And I've got three suggestions in terms of how one might deal with that, and I've got three caveats in terms of what needs to happen to make it happen effectively. So very briefly, and I know I'm between you and lunch, what we've been doing at the Institute of Psychiatry, the BRC I run at the Maudsley, has been to try and make use of electronic patient records. So we've got this enormous resource in terms of electronic records, and we basically put it through now a pipeline which de-identifies the record and renders the entire clinical record available for research use within a very tight security framework and governance framework, which is critically service user led. It's not just service users are represented, we have service users actually overseeing the governance framework. And this sits within an NHS firewall, and it allows people in this CRIS system, which stands for the Clinical Record Interactive Search. It allows researchers to be able to use the clinical record to make sense of the patient's journey and experience. And we've done a number of things, including data linkages to take the primary care data, for example, into this system, so we can actually see how people transition within those pathways. And I'll talk a little bit more about patient-reported data coming into that as well. So that's the sort of the background of where we're at. But the problem, of course, as I mentioned before, is that the data we input as clinicians is unstructured. It's absolutely hopeless trying to get clinicians to put in structured data. So we're absolutely hopeless at putting scores of things in. And I think this is important because as a psychiatrist, when I see people, I want to get a narrative. I don't want to tick boxes. I want to get a narrative. I want to hear what's happened to them. And that's reflected in the records I write. But how do I get information for research purposes out of that narrative? Well, the answer is natural language processing. And this is work which my colleague Rob Stewart and colleagues have been doing. And this first slide just demonstrates that if we're looking at something which is a relatively well-documented piece of information, this is people with early Alzheimer's disease who are coming to clinic looking at memory, we find that actually most people, the detail of this score, the mini mental state examination, which looks at cognitive state, the detail of that is locked in the clinical record. So there's only this tiny proportion, I'm sorry the labels have gone on this, I don't know why, but only a tiny proportion of people where the clinician has put it in the right place. The rest of the time it's spread out over the clinical record, so we don't know what to do with it. So we've developed apps using natural language processing, which basically goes into the record and identifies certain pieces of information like this, 5 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination, and it tells, the computer can then recognize, and this is done as an iterative process with people validating what the computer's saying, but the computer can recognize the score, and it can link it with a date, and it can come out with a date and a score, which we validate, and we get exceptionally good recall and precision on this in terms of validity. So we've now developed apps on a whole range of different symptoms and health behaviors and treatments to be able to try and get that, extract that out of the field. So what you do with this is being able to see what the patient's progress is on, for example, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors used in dementia. And what we were able to do is get data which was about 12 times the amount of clinical trial data in the entire world on these drugs from a single mental health trust, and be able to see the change in that score over time. So it's descending here. This is the point at which the drug is prescribed, and you start seeing a little blip, a little improvement, which lasts for 6 months or so, and then they carry on the downward trajectory, unfortunately. But it shows the effectiveness of the medication in this population. The interesting thing is this is almost exactly what you see in the clinical trial data, but we're able to do it using the routine data. So this is one approach, and one approach of enriching the mental health record is around the use of electronic health records and the use of natural language processing to get meaning. The second broad area is around what many of us have been talking about, which is patient-reported outcomes, where service users are putting information into a system. And I'm interested in systems which are interoperable, so that you actually have a way of collecting data which goes into the health record, so it's available to the patient service user, but also to the clinician. And this is one example, a scheme we've been running called IMPARTS, which stands for Integrating Mental and Physical Healthcare, where we're trying to recognize mental health problems presenting to the general hospital clinic, but we're uploading the information collected on iPads into the health record so that the clinician, who will be a physician or maybe even a plastic surgeon, sitting in a clinic will be able to see the information. And this means that you can actually then start getting quite detailed information about how different clinical services are doing. So we can do this as a touch of a button, being able to get information on the mental health experiences of the patients going to these clinics, but it's available also in the health record. I think the way this moves on to is not just apps for single diseases, but a patient health record. And we're developing, this is the sort of second version of My Health Locker, which is a patient health record, which allows people to input information and get things which are useful for them, and it's a platform for delivering apps, but it's also links them to their health records such that they're able to see care plans and information on medications and so forth. So it's co-produced between service users and clinicians and the software developers, but it allows that integration which is clinically useful. This is going through beta testing early next year, thanks to Kumar Jacob, who's in the audience there. The third aspect, the third type of technology which I think is going to be critical, is around going from the active monitoring of inputting data where the individual's actually answering questionnaires or whatever, to passive monitoring. And what we're particularly interested in is around wearable devices and smartphones and the information which can be gleaned from these. We have a couple of projects up and running at the moment, one on schizophrenia, service users with schizophrenia, looking at whether sleep picked up on a Fitbit and their smartphone can actually predict relapse. The remarkable thing about this is that the data collection of this project was finished quite quickly, and the remarkable thing is that people really got it and liked it. The service users had extremely good adherence to the protocol, and they saw it as being really helpful because they were getting information back. Whether it actually works in terms of predicting outcome, we don't know, but that's the aim, to try and find out. The example which I think comes out of the work on Parkinson's is particularly elegant, where because Parkinson's disease is characterized by a lack of movement and things like tremor, you can actually pick up using something like a Fitbit or a wearable device whether someone is actually asleep. Then you have a period where they're in the so-called off phase, when their musculoskeletal system isn't working, they're not able to move, which is recognized by the patient in their diary, but also by the wearable device. And then the on phase starts, they're getting a lot better, and then they have another phase when they stop moving so much and they're recognizing this as an off phase. This actually allows one to have streaming data on real-time clinical outcomes which matter to the individuals with these illnesses, which I think is incredibly powerful and will be very helpful in terms of determining outcomes, monitoring new treatments and so forth. So those are the three kind of approaches which I think, and there may be many others, but those are three approaches. Just very briefly, a couple of things which I think need to happen in order for this to work. The first thing is it's got to be collaborative, and we've heard about the importance of collaboration, not just between disciplines, but I think between centres. That there's a need for clinics and universities and SMEs and big digital to meet up in this space. There's a need for having the right mix of individuals with different skill sets to be able to make use of this. The second thing is that the user, the end user, needs to like what you're doing. And that applies to two particular groups. One is the clinician. So we've developed a series of hack days where we get clinicians to tell us what they don't like about the electronic health record, and we start trying to put it right, so that the activities in our group are not just seen as being some sort of, slightly kind of academic, unhelpful to clinicians, but they're actually, clinicians are coming back to us with exactly what they want to see, what they want changed. And this is very helpful because you start developing a dialogue and you start being able to enrich data streams in a way which actually becomes mutually beneficial to both parties. But last and absolutely not least, in fact it should be first and foremost, is the service user's experience. These technologies rely on people doing things and having things done to people and to their data, so there's issues of trust which are critical, and there are issues of confidentiality. But ultimately, there's a huge gain which can be made from this in terms of being able to identify adverse events from medication or which interventions are helpful. So when the care.data the care.data debacle broke out, where I think the difficulty had been a lack of trust between service providers, patients, and the care.data team, we were actually able to sort of put our model up. And Felicity Callard, as service user researcher, was up there as the chair of our governance board, saying how important it was that the data in her health record was actually being utilised for benefit of the wider individuals with mental health problems. And it is developing that trusting relationship which is critical. Thank you very much.
very much, Matthew. I think lunch does beckon, but if we could probably have one. Is there anybody who wants a question or the? Yes, I think down. Yes, in the middle here from. This is Julie. Yeah.
Thank you. This is Julie Hankin. I'm Medical Director at Nottinghamshire Healthcare Trust. So we are one of the follow-on behind you implementing a CRIS record. You talked about research and individuals, and that's very clear and powerful. I just wondered if you could comment on, has the Trust been able to use it in terms of overall quality of service, monitoring and improvement?
Yes. It's a powerful tool for audit. But also some of the apps we're developing in terms of being able to identify patterns in records, start telling you things which are informative about outcomes which really matter to my chief executive. So things like length of stay, for example. Rather than just being able to put in a few things which you would kind of already be aware of, we can use much wider range of information going into the health record to be able to tell you about which people are likely to have a prolonged length of stay. The other thing which we did very early on with this system was be able to, and we were one of the, this is one of the bits of evidence about the shocking reduction in life expectancy for people with major mental disorders. And that's had a direct impact in terms of our Trust's management of physical health. We went smoke-free. It became much higher up on the agenda as something which the Trust could actually do something much more actively about. So I think it is very powerful for people in your shoes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you again, Matthew. That was very inspiring.